Welcome to the Masters of Metrics podcast, helping you get more out of your digital marketing investment. This podcast is proudly hosted by Digivizer, a platform for people who want to grow their business by taking a data-driven approach. And now, here's your host, Emma Lo Russo.
Today, I'm joined by Lars Anthonisen, who is Google's head of marketing in Singapore, Malaysia, and the South Asian frontiers. He leads a team responsible for B2B ads marketing, consumer marketing, and ecosystem initiatives across Southeast Asia. Welcome to Masters of Metrics, Lars.
Thanks, Emma. Super excited to be with you here today.
I've always loved your story, so I'm keen to unpack it for our listeners. So if we take a big picture view of your career between when you started at Denmark and now you're working in Singapore, you've always had a passion for technology and marketing and where these sort of intersect and combine. Yeah. But you were early, right? You saw programmatic before it even became a thing, and you know marketing metrics from top to bottom. So I'm kind of keen, how did you get to pick this as your career choice? How did you stay ahead of the curve and, develop the career path you've been on?
It's a good question. Again, there's definitely coincidences along the way, right? That is the reason for us speaking together today. But I think definitely I had an interest on one side for marketing. And I always liked IT, and IT and technology comes in many shapes and forms. And 25 years back, it was of course very different from what it is today. And actually, it was quite interesting. I actually was planning to do business school. Okay. And 2 months before I was supposed to start, I actually pulled the plug on that. And then I actually went for a marketing degree instead. So I did a marketing degree. And when I was done with that, I could continue on the marketing track. I kind of really found that super interesting. But I could also go in and actually do something more with technology and IT, as I was talking about. And I actually chose the latter. And I went for a certificate of business in IT. Kind of the best way to explain it is think about SAP, implementations, project management, large scale waterfall models galore, and all those kind of things. And that was my way to combine kind of the two interests. And then what happened was that I worked for a consultancy at that time. They were very big on project management and other things. And what happened was that I had this kind of, okay, where do I go? Do I stay with the consultancy or do I do something else? And at that time, they didn't have kind of either marketing. I was doing a bit of marketing, but not a proper marketing role that I could grow into. And I wasn't really able to flex that other IT muscle that I wanted to flex. So I actually quit my job there and went job hunting. And I was quite lucky to then be able to combine the two in an ad tech startup, a company called Adform, which also exists today. And where I got to work with digital marketing, right? Combining the technology aspect of it, the tracking, the kind of setup of campaigns and so on. And of course, the more creative consumer insights piece. So that was the kind of background. And then again, we can go through the rest, but that's kind of why we're talking together today. That was the starting point.
I didn't realize you'd started in the startup to go back, into corporate. I've done the opposite, right? Corporate and then gone to startup. But there's lots of truths around digital marketing that's common for both. And in fact, it's the leverage. What have you seen change over time in technology? And what's your learnings? How have they evolved from maybe that early point to today?
If we go back to early 2000s, which is daring to say it's almost 20 years, right? I think, especially on digital marketing, I think one of the things that it was all impressions, clicks, click-through rate, right? Galore. And we are talking about masters of metrics here. So that was the metrics, that was the master within digital marketing, at least at that time. I think compared to today, one thing is you grow as an individual, of course, and learn along the way. And I've also been guilty to some extent in my earlier years, also being overly focused on click-through rates and saying this campaign is the bomb, right? It did amazing because it had this click-through rate, right? I think today it's a spectrum. I like to think about it as a spectrum at least, right? So on one side, you have kind of the media metrics, in-process metrics, things like click-through rates, reach, and all that, which is important. But then at the other side, you have kind of the meaningful business impact metrics, right? Which would be revenue, sales, and growth, and so on, right? And in between that, you have a whole spectrum, right? Brand lift studies, marketing mix modeling, multi-touch attribution, match panel analysis, all those kind of things that you can do to actually track your impact of it. And what you want to do is, of course, move as far as you can into tracking the impact, right? That's meaningful to the business. I would have to say, as I know we were talking about metrics today, I was reflecting a bit on the last year plus, and I've been judging some awards recently as well. Click-through rates are still being championed as the measure of success for campaigns, which I think, it's okay as an in-progress and process metric, but it's probably not the end outcome for many things, right? Yeah.
No, I think you touched though, like it's different objectives for different stages of the funnel. And I think in the end, it still has to land on business impact. So you started in Denmark and you're obviously now based in Singapore and looking after the Southeast Asian markets. You talked about 2000 starting point to 20 years later. How are the regions different, right? You don't have a single view. You've got a per country, different maturity rates. What's your view of the differences in those regions and how someone might be approaching that if they were looking to target them?
It's another good question. I think, again, if you look at it from a marketing perspective, right, fundamentally there isn't a difference, right? Because marketing, of course, still is the same in terms of starting with the consumer, understanding them, that delivers hopefully some good insights that you can build on. You then choose to segment, or you segment the market and choose who to target, right? Think about the positioning of that, and then you create your strategy, which is basically where you then pick and start picking your comms and channel choices, right? So I think from that point of view, it's the same. And probably you've heard this many times, but at Google, we look at it kind of know the user, know the magic, and combine and connect the two, right? But I think that said, there's a lot of differences, of course, in consumers, and therefore also the insights, which I touched upon. And a good example, of course, would be the rapid growth of access across Southeast Asia, right? As an example, last year in Southeast Asia, we had more than 40 million people who came online for the first time, right? Wow. And they all came online via mobile, right? So of course that has implications on how you want to do marketing and how you want to go to market, compared to maybe, again, take us back again 20 or 15 years, right? Again, a lot of people that came online for the first time back then would buy desktops, especially in the developed markets, right? So it's a very different consumer that you have to target and engage with, right? Because they have a whole different history, right? That would be some of my thoughts on that.
I mean, it's been interesting. We play in Asia ourselves, and so I've had that kind of close hand of the role of the mobile being the only source of where people are getting their information, and then the opening up of banking online, and the innovation that's kind of, consumer digital first in every part of the design, but the innovation that sort of sits behind that, because it's not sort of started with bricks and mortar and this heritage and all these things that people think, money and safety is based on. Have you seen differences in different countries, different industries, that mature versus emerging, that you think is worth highlighting as difference in maybe the types of metrics you see coming through?
I think there's always these interesting cases, and whether you want to call them digital natives, as you were just talking through, right? And I think companies born out of an opportunity or consumer need that is digital first, of course, is very different from some, as you said, some of the brick and mortar kind of companies that basically started at a different place, right? So I think from that point of view, you have many different companies across APAC that is great examples of that, especially as we have so massive populations in these markets, right? So there's a massive opportunity, and yeah, again, if it's not the one thing, then it's the other in terms of tapping in and launching something. And again, the obvious ones that comes to mind, that probably many people are aware of, is of course the Shoppies, the Lazadas of the world here in Southeast Asia, right? SEA Group, who owns Shopee, of course, have other legs in the business as well, and they are also going into finance now. But I think it's just interesting to see how, also during COVID, of course, how they've grown and really tapping into that consumer need, which has just been accelerated through COVID and the last 1 year plus.
Yeah, I mean, for someone, obviously being based in Australia, but probably spending more time in, North America and UK, one of the things that excited me when I was going and spending a lot more time in Asia was these three-way marketplaces where there is no fixed point for anyone, like the purchaser, the vendor, and even where the goods may be picked up, that all these things could be variables. And then seeing, for instance, yes, Uber, proliferated in the US first and then here, but then you look at GoCheck and some of these things in Asia with all the services that were already bundled in and provided, that it's really the consumer is in power. And it's that can serve digitally that makes the difference.
Yeah, especially also when you look at it from that consumer angle, right? You come online on mobile and whatever your first touch point is, but again, these super apps, right? That then start to offer you a variety. You can order your food, but you can also shop. You can get deliveries, right? And so on and so on, right? So finance, as you also touched upon, right? So there's a whole spectrum of these super apps are building, whether it's Grab or the GoCheck or whatever it is of the world, right? Which is quite interesting, but of course matches with that consumer behavior, right? And I think that's the insight, right? It's not just a company trying to push. It's based on actually a consumer wanting these kind of services, right? Which is quite interesting.
I mean, it also, and I know we're sort of going a little bit off the types of questions that I thought we'd be on, but who owns the brand and the role of brand in the way it was before? Because choice seems to be the thing that a consumer wants, a delightful, frictionless experience to get what they want in the fastest, easiest possible way. That's not necessarily connected to a brand that might have been building their values. They've got to be the ones sort of innovating and providing that. What have you observed over this period with that change?
I think because there's so much choice, marketing, of course, if you look at it from a company perspective, marketing is playing a crucial role there, and it's playing a crucial role in two ways, right? It's again, and let's just stick with for the simplicity of it, let's stick with a Grab kind of company, right? They need people to, of course, download. So there's the performance angle, right? Download and usage of the apps, right? And their services. So that's a performance play, right? At the same time, you need to establish that brand, right? Because again, the long and short of it, right? Which is many marketeers talk about, right? Yeah. I think you need that combination, and that still stays true today. And I think, yes, you need to establish your brand in the mind of the consumer, but you also need to drive some action, right? And many of these digital natives maybe start out with, okay, we need X amount of users, right? Because we can monetize them and we can figure out we can grow from there. We can get more investment because we can show that we have X million users on the platform. But then at the same time, as they mature, and it's quite early for most of them right now, they need to build that brand, right? And they need to start establishing that brand a lot better in the minds of the consumer, which then drive preference, because the choice is, again, out there, right? You can choose between a Grab or, as you said, an Uber or whatever it is, right? So again, that longer term branding play is still important also for these players.
By the way, I do agree. I'm a big fan of making sure you're investing in brand, because that's where the trust and relationship builds. And of course, it's not a one-off transaction in digital. It's the continuous journey and nurture and way you continue to delight them. So let's talk. I mean, Google's an incredible innovator and a great partner, obviously for us as well. But you still felt the impacts of COVID. You've been running innovative events, and particularly this was in your remit across Asia, but COVID 2020 meant you couldn't run the events in the same way.
Yeah, sure.
How did you pivot? What did that look like in terms of innovating to digital events? And what did you learn through having to make those changes? What worked for you?
Yeah, I think COVID has so on one side, there's basically the forced need to pivot, right? Because as you said, we couldn't do the face-to-face, and especially in B2B, there is a lot of events. That's one of the ways to engage your customers, right? So there's definitely a need to pivot, right? And many companies pivoted. But on the other side, there's also an opportunity to do things differently, innovate, right? So I think a good example of this was Brandcast. I don't know how familiar you are with it, but Brandcast is our annual YouTube, normally a face-to-face event for advertisers and agencies that we do across markets. We do it in the US and we do it here in Asia as well. And we knew actually we couldn't do it, of course, with COVID as a backdrop, the way that we normally would. And I think, I don't know about you, Emma, but again, at least for me, we all reached the point last year, quite fast, where you reach the point of live stream fatigue, right? Tuning into another person bopping around and talking for an hour or two nonstop, right? So again, we needed to challenge what we normally do, and we knew that this was an opportunity to do so. So we shifted Brandcast online. And I think the team took it on themselves to push the boundaries. And here in Southeast Asia, again, we talked about there's many nuances and differences in markets. Here in Southeast Asia, we actually came together as a team and created a personalized experience. And by personalized experience, I mean, you got to pick the host, first of all. So there's a choice of host. You then got to choose kind of the content. So again, a simple example would be more branding related versus more performance related, as well as a musical performance, and thereby creating this customized show or experience, right? That worked really well for us because again, it was customized. It felt for you. It would have your name on it. So Emma, if you were tuning in, you would be greeted with your name, and you would have had that influence on the content. So be much more personalized. And we just managed to engage the audience in a very different way and saw some great results of that. So that's a great example of, again, needing to pivot, but also opportunity to innovate.
Sounds fantastic. Are there any kind of key metrics out of that you can compare face-to-face to that experience? Would you, if you can do physical events again, is it going to be something you've learnt from one to take to the other, or combinations of both?
I think generally my learnings through the last year plus, right, has been that it's not all bad if you look at it from the perspective of us getting pushed. So I think for us, yes, we'll continue to do a mix of both, right? Because we've seen that it can work. But there is something about that human interaction, right, that you cannot kind of replace in a virtual world, right? So it's not like we're fully switching over. It will be a combination, but we've seen that it can work. And this is just one example. We've done many, many different ones throughout the last year. And we can see it's working. So yeah, I would say it's going to be a mix as we go forward. Whether it's 50-50, 60-40, I don't know, but definitely a mix.
Very good. I must admit, I was invited to some, I guess, COVID-inspired different ways that Google engaged with getting CEO founders together of tech companies and having a more, because one of the things at events, you have the networking ability that you don't get you don't normally get in a digital event, but it was also facilitated brilliantly. And I think a form of innovation that you guys showed. Just on that, I think you're a user or a promoter of agile methodology. A lot of tech companies, but even some of the big brands and older brands have looked to adopt agile marketing and methodology, and the heart of that is that test and learn mindset. Is this something that you are adopting always? Is it been a recent thing? What would you say to people thinking about why they should adopt that methodology in their marketing approach?
I think starting point is, so me personally, I believe that the marketeers generally and constantly, needs to push themselves to try something new, right? Because you can always go back and do what you always done, right? That's not, so having a kind of a mindset where you allow yourself to, again, whether that's the Coke 70, 2010, and I just had a recent, on LinkedIn, I actually had a recent, I posted a link to a Think with Google article that had to do with experimentation. And again, I had some replies on that, of course, and some engagement. There were people who were asking kind of the mindset. I love it. Yes, people need to push themselves, but sometimes it's easier said than done, which I totally agree with, right? But again, if you're a bit more purposeful about it, right, then I think it's not for the sake of doing it. This is for the sake of learning, right? You don't know what you don't know. Yep. So, and also through that, you potentially uncover new insights, more impactful ways, as we were just talking about, of doing what you need to do. And of course, you also need the org to be supportive. So I'm in an environment right now where we, of course, generally are very innovative and open to different ways of doing things. But again, you should always try and push, and if you can get an okay to test something, and it should also be okay to fail, right? So again, if you test something, it doesn't mean that it always works, right? So that culture of being able to learn from something that potentially doesn't work, right? And it doesn't have to be big, right? It can be small. A/B testing on landing pages, small tweaks on your creatives, background color, copy, all those kind of things, right? And I think that 70-20-10 is one way to look at it. It could also be simpler than that, right? It could be 80-20, 90-10. But again, just being specific about it and push yourself to at least actually think about testing and learning, I believe that will make you a better marketeer.
Agree. I love the, like you talked about, some of little changes in digital can have a huge impact, right? If you've got that as a continuous mindset of a hypothesis, if we change X or test A to B, which one's going to deliver something better? And, each one of those ultimately drives a better outcome, or, conversion or cost per conversion, whatever is the outcome that you're looking for. It's really a slam dunk. My one strategy idea is going to change the world. It's a series of learnings, and digital really helps you do that. Just metrics as a concept. What metrics do you touched on a couple of where they sit, whether it's brand or business impact, but say you are yourself commissioning an advertising campaign, or you're dealing with some of the big customers. What are you asking them or recommending as a measure of success in a campaign?
Yeah, I think I'll stick to my own turf in terms of when we do campaigns or activations, it's that same spectrum, first of all, right? So again, that breadth of metrics, right, I was talking about earlier. I think very much, again, you want to skew as much to the meaningful business impact. And it could be, in the case of B2B marketing, incremental revenue that you unlock, right? So do you, and we have some different methodologies around that, but again, people who are engaged with, let's say, a virtual event versus others who aren't engaged, is there a higher growth? Are you seeing growth and adoption in the 60, 80, 90 days after that, or stuff like that, right? So that would be one side of it. There will definitely also be the whole piece, and we talked about brand before, right? So the preference piece, right, and how you measure that. So you can always do pre and post. Let's stick with events, right? Pre and post event kind of measurements, but there's also the ongoing brand health tracking. Of course, our brands in the market, and for us, if we stick with that ads marketing, it would be, of course, advertisers and agencies that we work with, right? Mm-hmm. Is there a preference? Awareness, generally, we're in a good place there as Google, but also, is there a preference? What are the different attributes that are associated with a potential preference, and so on, right? So that would be some of the things that we would be looking at.
So I'm hearing in all the things that you're saying that you value metrics, and data is one of the thing that helps you make decisions or helps you keep that
For
test
sure.
and learn mindset.
Yeah.
Why should a marketer care about data? Why is it so crucial to them succeeding?
I think first point would be that it goes back to what I was talking about: insights, knowing your audience, knowing your consumers, right? I don't think it's so much about the data itself necessarily, but what you can get from that data, right? And those insights you can get. And of course, there's also we talked about A&B testing, but generally how you measure the impact. So if you think about campaigns, right, how do you optimize your campaigns, right? If you're not moving those metrics that you want, you need to do something differently, right? And especially if you're a performance marketer, of course, that's focused on driving conversions, your site or an app, right? The data is, of course, essential, right? Because I remember many years ago presenting to an advertiser, and I was trying to tell them a bit about how performance marketeers look at it, because it was as you talked about, a brick and mortar, a very branding heavy organization, right? And they needed to start selling their products online. And it was one of those where you have a mindset of $1 in, more than that $1 out, right? So $1 in, maybe $2 out, then you keep investing, right? But they were very fixed in that mindset of, okay, brand campaign, again, we'll launch and then we see if there's impact, right? Whereas the performance marketer, you need to be a bit more agile, right? And I think it comes back to that long term. I don't say branding is not important, but the long term you need to invest in for the brand, and then there's the short term where you need that revenue, right? And there's a huge linkage, of course, back and forth between those two. Yeah.
This might be kind of like the inverse. Where do you see people getting their measurements wrong, or they're focusing on the wrong things? What have you observed?
It's a good question. I think, again, you also get an abundance of data sometimes, right? So that's one of the things that of course, you can get into, where you basically are overloaded with data and you can't find your way out almost, right? So that whole thing about when you start your campaign, or before you start your campaign, before you start your strategy, figure out what's the objective, right? And how you're going to measure the impact, right? Is I think that linkage would make it easier. And then I think the other thing, which we talked about at the beginning, generally have still a lot of marketeers, as I was saying, in terms of award entries and so on, but the click-through rates of the world, right? And just that's not the end goal. It's fine as an in-process metric, but again, what does it mean to your business more than that, right? They probably clicked through, came to point X, which could be a website, then they did something. What is that something, that action you want them to do, right? And if it's not an action, if it's a branding exercise, you need to measure it, of course, with surveys or something else, right? So yeah, that would probably be two examples.
So if you were giving advice to marketers to take a more data-driven approach so that they do have the right levers in front of them, whether it's the methodology they apply in their organization, the data sources that they go to, their thinking, the metrics that they should put in place, what would your advice be? Like, if you were starting from day one, what would you help give guidance? This is what you need to do to be successful.
I think, first of all, be super clear about your objective, right? As I was just mentioning, and therefore your metrics, the data that you want to collect upfront. You also want to set some smart targets or objectives, right? So again, specific, measurable, right? So again, if specific could be the who and the what, right? Measurable would be more, it could be a benchmark, right? So again, where are you at today? Where do you want to get to? Or it could be a overall target, right, of X number of new customers. Ambitious, as we were talking about testing and learning, I think you also need to push yourself, stretch goal that's worth all the effort, go after it to win. Realistic at the same time, so you don't want to go too crazy. You also want to be, you want it to be achievable, of course, as well. And then time bound, right? I think that's the one that's often is missed out, right? And if you have a campaign, you can measure it there. But again, especially if you're a brand marketeer, is it that 1 year that you have do X, right? But just set kind of a window of that. But I don't think it's about just collecting the data. It's kind of how you leverage it and to drive that competitive advantage, right? I think one of the things I'm quite, and I don't pretend to be an expert at all, but I find quite intriguing also with that combination of tech and marketing is of course what kind of tools can do and help with data can help uncover new things. But the way to uncover it, as we're talking about, get a bit overloaded with data sometimes is AI ML to make really sense of these huge data sets, right? Which I'm quite intrigued about and quite fascinated about. And I think one of the things that comes to mind is a case where an F&B company used AI ML to figure out what their next ice cream flavor would be, right? So taking a data set of millions of ice cream consumer photos from the likes of Instagram, right? Applied ML to it, and through that made sense of what consumers wanted, right? And then they went and produced it, right? And it was a success. It's just that's pretty cool, if you ask me, right? Yes. That's amazing that you can do that.
And I think if you also apply that in the use insight to help you make better decisions, then you test it, right? Like either that was going to be successful or not. Much better to use that amount of data than a data point of one, which is how it used to be.
Yeah,
I started a boardroom or a CMO, and they'd be like, well, my daughter said X, Y, Z. This is my experience, and you're just like, well, there's millions of other people that are actually demonstrating what they do or care about through these greater data sources.
Yeah, for sure, and especially also with surveys, right? N equals 1,000, right? In terms of going out and surveying 1,000 people. Again, you don't necessarily need that all the time. You can just tap into stuff like that. So yeah, I'm wowed by those kind of examples for sure.
No, they sound amazing. Actually, I'd love to ask you, where do you think digital marketing is going to go, or marketing anyhow? Like, where do you see the trends, the possibilities? You talked about AI and ML as part of the information source or the data insights that can be helped. And it would be interesting also to hear, maybe while you're thinking of that, like what's the role of the marketer in the future, right? If all these insights are available, like what's their role in this?
Some good questions. I think definitely AI, ML, and data is going to help fuel kind of the future of marketing. But that said, I don't think the advice to marketeers and myself is don't forget the fundamentals of marketing, right? You start with the consumer because you can easily go on a different path, right? With all that data we're just talking about, but start with the consumer and be clear around your objectives and therefore also then the data and measurement that you're doing. So I think that's one side. It's hard to predict what the future is going to look like, but I think you won't have less. I think we'll probably have more opportunity to measure, to track, but again, you then have to make sure that you make sense of all that extra data that you get in, right? So yeah, I think that would probably be the short answer without me having a crystal ball to look into.
Well, if only you could. Imagine that. I think the other thing which you guys also included in your event plans is that personalization. How do you get consumers to want to engage and feel like that you actually using that data to create better experiences for them? I think that's going to be really interesting as time goes on, and there's all the privacy and platforms like Apple choosing to do things differently and tracking. But in the end, if a customer wants to exchange data for a better experience, like what does that mean for us as marketers as well?
Yeah, that is true. But I think also, overall, going back to what we're talking about with the branding and the performance, or the long and the short of it, right? Again, you want to make sure you have awareness. So that's a wider spectrum of consumers you're going after, and a bit more generic, right? I don't necessarily think that still needs to be rooted on insights. You need to segment and target properly, but I think that's one side of things. And then you have the short of it, the performance, the shorter term business impact you want to deliver. And there, I think that's where you want to get much more targeted. And I think it's interesting to see what happens to especially also digital marketing with the privacy conversations that are going on, of course, as well, and the new tools and opportunities that are coming out as well.
And do you think it's at all different for B2B?
I think you still need to establish your brand, right? And you still need to engage. But I think the only difference, I would say, at least in my experience, is that some of the sales cycles on the B2B side, again, if you think about a F&B, stick with ice cream, right? The consideration phase is probably a bit shorter. If I see a nice ad for an ice cream and I have the right mood, then I'll probably just take my phone and buy it, right? Whereas if I'm investing in a new cloud solution or a new ad tech product or whatever it is, right? Or I need to buy into advertising, there's a longer cycle, right? So I think that's one of the interesting dynamics I've seen in play in the B2B world that I don't see as much. Of course, there's cars and house buy and whatever not. There's those high considerations, of course, on the B2C side, but generally on the B2B side, I see a lot longer cycles. Yeah.
So we'll start to wrap up. I'm just going to encourage everyone who's listening, follow Lars on LinkedIn. It's probably one of the best marketing feeds that I know of. Very genuine, curated, unique commentary. It is Lars himself that is writing and choosing and publishing what is highly relevant, and particularly if you want to get a lens into Asia. Is there anything interesting, a project you're working on that you'd share now, Lars, that we might hear from you on?
Yeah, I think I already shared this, but again, you can go and have a look. I don't know if you saw this, Emma, actually, but we have something that the team, and honestly, it's a global and very cross-functional effort, so I won't take any credit or very little credit at least, right? But we have something that we launched called Destination Insights. So again, during this last year or so, right, of course, travel and the challenges around not being able to travel and the travel industry and what they've been facing is one of the things that we've been, of course, also seeing and trying to look at where we can support. So long story short, we launched a travel tool that was developed during COVID to support the travel industry, right? And then it provides and allows you to monitor travel trends. And that was actually made by our team here in Singapore and APAC, which has then been kind of distributed into the world. So you can go and find that at destinationinsights.withgoogle.com. That's one. Another one that comes to mind would be my team recently released a new report on brand websites. We call it brand.com, but whatever you have as a brand website, and marketplaces and the role in the path to purchase, which is quite interesting. It was some new research we did in Singapore, Indonesia, and Thailand. So very interesting findings in my point of view. So that's on Think with Google, our thought leadership platform. And there's an APAC version of that as well. So you can find an abundance of thought leadership and insights there and great tools. Again, I was talking about Destination Insights, but I think Google Trends and Test My Site is other great tools that you potentially will benefit from as a marketer.
Very true. And they are all out there, or you can just follow Lars and you get a curated highest value points right there on your phone when you're in the platform. I'm going to ask you now some rapid fire questions. What's your guilty pleasure?
It has to be Haribo. So it's gummies and preferably the variants and flavors you get in Denmark. Again, I always thought when I grew up it should be rapid fire, as you said, but just context, I always thought it was a Danish brand, but it's not. It's from Germany, right? But still, you have Danish variations of that. But anyways, that's my guilty pleasure.
Pick a brand or brands that inspire you and why.
Good question. I tend to look a lot on the car industry just for personal interest currently. I think what one of the ones that popped out was Polestar, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but it's Volvo's electrical car brand. Both from the product perspective, I found that, and from the brand perspective and the positioning, and of course the journey they're on, right? An electric vehicle, better for the environment, those kind of things. And and some interesting ads as well. And we talked about brick and mortar before. Quite interesting in terms of having just a showroom, everything is delivered like with the Tesla and so on. So I think Tesla competitor in the making, and I think they're getting quite good reviews. So that would be one, just comes to mind.
We'll check it out. And if you could pick an age that you could stay for the rest of your life, what age would that be and why?
That's a tough one. Yeah, every age has its pros and cons. Good question. I don't know. I'm just going to maybe 8 or 9 years old, just because you're playful, very free, super creative, have a lot of fun. Yeah, I think that would be my answer on that one.
So don't go home and show your kids and wife that one, right?
No. Yeah. But at least from a playful, very free point of view. But again, there are so many pros and cons of different ages, right?
It's a hard question, and I'm always intrigued by people's answers. So, and they're all different and varied. So,
I'm intrigued to hear your answer, Emma.
Well, we'll save that for another time. Listen, Lars, thank you so much for joining us today on Masters of Metrics. I've really enjoyed getting to know you over the years, and it delights me that someone like you is responsible for engaging all those brands, big and small, literally the biggest brands, as well as those startups within your remit across Asia. Your care factor and your expertise that you bring to that has always been inspiring. So I'm glad that we got to share that further today. Lots of good tips there. It can be simple, right? Break it down. Start with your objective, understand the role of brand, and as well as the outcomes, have that learning mindset. I think there was so much gold in what you shared today. So huge thank you.
No, thank you, Emma. I really enjoyed it. We could probably go on for, I don't know, another hour or so. But yeah, we can do that separate time, and I can hear about
part 2. We'll come back.
Yeah, we can do part 2, and then you have to promise me to talk to me about what age you would be.
Will do.
For the rest of your life. Yeah.
Will do. All right. So thank you. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Masters of Metrics. You can find links to the campaigns we talked about today in the show notes, particularly some of those references that Lars talked about. Head to our website to find an outline of this episode and browse other episodes. This podcast is hosted by Digivizer, and I'm Emma Lo Russo. Thanks, Lars. Bye for now.